Hi everybody. Thank you for joining me here today. I'd also like to thank the team behind the Women in Automotive Canadian Leadership Forum for organizing this event and for asking me to speak. It's been a strange time for us all, but in a year when it would have been easy to skip, it's nice to have this digital event for us to come together and share some ideas. I was thinking about how to get started today, and I think the best thing is to just ask you a few simple questions for you to think about. So, who here has felt unfairly labeled at work? I'll put my hand up. Who's felt patronized or objectified? Who's watched much less qualified men be promoted over you? Who's been insulted with words like bossy or a bitch? I've even gotten the C word a couple of times. I'll tell you a quick story on this subject. Some years ago, I went to work for a dealership, and in the early days there, it seemed like everything was going great. I was often the only woman in a room full of guys who were joking around and telling stories in the very colorful way that guys do at a dealership. And since I've always had a bit of a potty mouth myself, I certainly felt like I fit right in. Then one day, I heard that I was wearing a new label. I heard that I was being called vulgar. So what's the point of that story? The point is that we as women in this industry are expected to follow a different set of rules than the guys are. And when we break those rules, we're going to wear a generally unflattering label. So I'm here today to talk about gender-based conflict in automotive. But before we do that, I'd like to take a minute to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about how I got here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dee Murphy, and I'm the VP of Dealer Experience for Autocorp Technologies. Sometime a little over a decade ago, I was working for Carleton University here in Ottawa in the Department for Law and the Center for Conflict Education and Research, where my work was really focused on deconstructing conflict and understanding what motivates people to fight. The bottom line is that conflict is derived from a sense of some perceived threat. It's about fear. If you think about any fight you've recently had, what caused that fight? If you peel away the layers, something inside of you triggered a threat and it caused a reaction. So one year the university hosted a symposium that had a stream on international conflict resolution. What was fascinating was that all the same theory applied. Even on a large scale, conflict boiled down to the perception of threat. In those days, I certainly thought my career was going in a different direction, so I ran off to Costa Rica to do a master's in international law and the settlement of disputes, and I came back to Ottawa ready to change the world. Then one day, shortly after coming home, I was having coffee with an old boss, and he said, "Hey, obviously this is not on your roadmap, but since you're not working, and while you're looking, why don't you come work for me doing non-prime financing?" At the time, I was a single mom, and my only focus was on supporting my family, so I was happy for the work. I had an interesting realization as I was thinking through how to describe my automotive journey in the early days. My initial memory was that I was too focused on my need to build a career that would provide for my family that I didn't even notice what was going on around me. That's a nice thought, but it's just not true. The truth is that from the moment I entered the automotive industry, I was very aware of what I perceived to be a systemic subjugation. I experienced men using their positions of power over me in a variety of ways. I also want to tell you that I didn't care, that I was too blinded by ambition to care about the actions of others. But that's a lie too. I did care. I just needed my job, and I didn't have the luxury of doing anything about it. Part of why I'm here today is because I know that there are many women in this industry, and perhaps even listening to me today, who are in this same position. They too don't have the luxury to stand on principle at the expense of their livelihoods. As time went on, I eventually found myself sitting in the business office at a franchise store, and life started to feel a little easier. That's when I found my voice. Someone asked me recently what the barriers are that are holding women back, and I started to think about that. The truth is, the list is long. What's also true is that regardless of how it's being manifested, the bottom line is that women are held to a different standard than the men are. It's just a fact. So that things that are acceptable for guys to do for a woman to behave in the exact same way, she's going to be judged differently. Let me give you an example. Not long ago, I was in an environment that was pretty toxic, where there was a group of people who were pretty intent on giving me a hard time. It was a difficult situation for sure. And one day I was speaking with one of the senior managers about it, and he let me know that it's because I'm a bitch. He flatly just said, "Well, it's because you're just a bitch." Now, here's where it gets interesting. His response to me when I said, "Why would you say that?" was, "Well, you give as good as you get." I was floored. It seemed crazy to me that what was being judged was my response to being attacked, instead of the fact that I shouldn't have to deal with being attacked in the first place. So the fact that I stand up for myself, I'm wearing a label. And the fact that I stand up for myself in a way that's more effective than the initial attack, I wear a label. But nobody is talking about the fact that I should never have had to deal with being attacked in the first place. So for a manager, what happens is that all these labels that are attached to women now become something that has to be managed. So instead of being an asset to your dealership, with all your unique skills and perspectives, you've become a liability. The fact is, everybody brings a unique perspective to the workplace. It's not that women are better communicators or subscribe to some other stereotype. It's that this person is different than that person. Each of us has a lifetime of experience that causes us to view the world through our own unique lens. And it's having all of these different experiences as part of your staff that really makes the environment rich. But what ends up happening is that instead of recognizing the particular attributes as strengths in female employees, these have become labels that have to be managed. Instead of assertive, she's a bitch. Instead of determined or ambitious, she's stubborn. Instead of a leader, she's pushy or bossy. And then as a woman, how do you navigate that? Do you laugh it off? Develop a thick skin? Let it go? Try to be a little less of yourself? Truthfully, I think that's what most women do. But by doing that, aren't we just perpetuating it? We can't stand on the platform, waiting for a train that feels like it's running behind schedule. We all need to be the ones driving that train. One thing I think I know is that you can't change something unless you know why it is. So I started looking at all of this and why it is the way it is. In doing so, I stumbled across the concept of gender-coded language. Now, I know we have some HR people in our mix today, so this is likely not a foreign concept for you. It was for me. And for those of you who, like me, were not familiar with the term, the premise is that job advertisements that use masculine wording are less appealing to women. So jobs that list characteristics like leadership will elicit more male candidates than female candidates. And the intention of this article was to ensure that recruiters also use words that appeal to female candidates to ensure a gender-balanced applicant pool. Statistically speaking, words like ambitious, challenging, analytical, having objectives, drive, or assertiveness will attract male candidates, whereas words like collaborative, understanding, compassionate, and responsive will attract female candidates. Although I applaud recruiting processes that promote gender-balanced workplaces, I couldn't help but be blown away by the underlying message here. And that is that statistically speaking, we as women don't see ourselves as having these qualities. Certainly not to the extent that we feel confident enough applying for jobs that require them. This is the problem. It's the ultimate self-perpetuation of institutionalized gender labeling that we have created for ourselves. So why are we doing that? Research shows that social programming starts teaching girls from a young age to be more quiet and submissive than boys. And when they break these gender norms, they're often criticized, disliked, and labeled with words like bossy, which can then discourage girls from aspiring to be leaders when they grow up. These labels change the way that girls and eventually women will think of themselves. The principle of propaganda states that the seed of suggestion can flourish into the most deeply rooted belief system if it's planted strategically. I'll tell you another story to illustrate the point. In dealerships that have both a prime business office and a separate non-prime business office, an inherent tension seems destined to exist. This goes back to the perception of threat. It's because in those situations, there is normally a period of time that the business manager has with a file before it gets turned over to the non-prime office for them to work it. There's a lot of good reasons for doing this, not the least of which is that in most stores, the workflow into the prime business office is predicated on files moving through quickly. And files that need extra work or exceptions can sit. The irony here is that the prime business office is too busy. In stores that do not have a dedicated non-prime office, these files do sit, and deals are lost. And although on a per-file basis by business manager, the amount of files that end up turning over to non-prime is nominal, taking a file away is always a problem. I can remember standing in sales offices practically ready to rock, paper, scissors over who was going to go in and grab that file because it wasn't going to be me. I've worked at a number of stores, and the story is the same everywhere you go. The file gets turned over to non-prime, followed by a dark period between you and that business manager. Some will say it's part of their charm. I'm just not one of them. Anyway, once upon a time, I went to do non-prime for this store, and there was a business manager who was really not very happy about it. The objection he gave was that it was going to cost him money. So very quietly, he started to plant seeds. He would talk to salespeople and he would say things like, "You don't know her," or "Just you wait and see." Or he'd make faces and sounds when the non-prime department was being discussed. So without saying anything, he was saying everything. Before too long, there was a general sense of mistrust towards the non-prime office, but nobody knew why. At what point, a new sales guy came in and he asked me what it was all about. I told him that I had no idea, but that if he could figure it out, to please come and let me know. So why would this manager do this? Was he just being a jerk? Although how he chose to resist the new non-prime department certainly made that argument. It doesn't answer why he was resistant to the new non-prime department. For many years while working for this company, I was the only female manager in a non-administrative role, but there were other women in the building. The receptionist was female, the accounting staff was almost entirely female, and he wasn't being a jerk to them. So why was he being one to me? The short answer to that would be that people in what he perceived to be subordinate roles didn't trigger fear in him. So now you might be saying that this has nothing to do with gender, but instead this is about the inherent tension that exists. That would have been easier to accept, but it's just not the case. When I stepped away from this job for a little while, it was filled with a male candidate, and the business managers welcomed him. They bought him coffees. They even took him to lunch. I never got a coffee, but I did get called something that started with a C. One of the theories of conflict resolution that I studied is called the insight approach. This approach positions conflict as emanating from the experience of threat to deeply held values and beliefs that then trigger individuals and groups to protect and defend themselves. So when somebody's defending themselves, oftentimes the way that they express that will then trigger a threat response in the originating party. So what does that look like? Well, let's say that I say something that upsets you, but instead of questioning why I said that or letting me know that it was hurtful, most people just fire back. Well, let's say I didn't mean to hurt your feelings and you just took a shot at me. Well, now I'm mad too. And either I say something bad or just as often I go away to stew and I really let it all settle in. This back and forth pattern of threat and response is referred to as a defense pattern of interaction. It creates very low trust environments. And it often happens because everybody is interpreting their own meaning to the events they are experiencing based on what they have experienced in their past. I'll give you a story to illustrate the point. There was a time in my previous life when I was conducting a mediation between two deeply entrenched parties who just couldn't hear what the other was saying. So there's an area of study within mediation around the concept of who owns meaning. For example, I'm here talking with you today, and I have an intended message that I want you to receive. But is that the meaning that you're taking away? Maybe. Maybe not. So who owns the meaning of this message? Is it my job to speak in a way that you hear what I want you to hear? Or do you create your own meaning and your own takeaways? This is what was happening in this particular mediation. So much so that at one point, I just stopped the conversation altogether, and I simply asked one of the parties to repeat back what they had heard the other person saying. Their response was shocking to the person who had just spoken, because it wasn't at all what they had intended to say. So I asked them to say it again. We repeated that pattern for quite some time before the intended message could truly be heard. Now, in some workplaces, mediated conflict resolution is available. In automotive, unfortunately, we're just not there yet. But I did feel that I could apply these principles to try and discover the source of this particular threat. Of course, my interpretation of another person's threat is colored by my experience, and therefore based on assumptions, which might not have gone deep enough to really pull out the roots. But on the surface, it seemed easy to identify some. We've already talked about gender normative behavior and how I had won various labels because I don't walk on the expected side of the line. So that's a threat. Society is predicated on the predictability of people subscribing to normative behavior. So that was strike one against me. We also talked about the threat of losing money that's created by deals being taken away. In most stores, once a deal leaves the business office, that business manager is no longer commissioned on that deal. So if this is a customer that they have spent some time on, where they did a full turnover and likely sold some product, they aren't going to be happy if they see that file getting delivered through a non-prime process and they aren't being commissioned on it. So there's strike two. Then there's the ego factor. This is a much more difficult threat to disarm because it has the deepest root system. In fact, social psychologists in our midst will know that Maslow's hierarchy of needs lists esteem needs, which includes the ego, as being a basic human instinct that plays a major role in motivating behavior. So I don't want to downplay its impact or the lengths to which people will go to protect against this particular threat. I mentioned earlier that I did a stint in the prime business office. It wasn't for long. While I was in retail, my love for this industry lived in non-prime financing. It felt like more of a puzzle to me than being in the prime business office. I embraced the challenge of recognizing lender buying patterns so that I could look at a bureau and know exactly what to say and to whom to mitigate risk enough with the lender to get the paper bought. I like learning the nuances of what lenders had sensitivities around. I can say this now that my job no longer is to sell cars, but for me, the win was never about delivering the car. It was successfully arguing a point to the bank to either get an approval or improve the one that I already had. Hitting a big number of deliveries never fired me up like getting a full decline overturned prime. Most of us take pride in our work and want to be thought of as good at our jobs. I know I do. So I get that when someone's able to do something that you have said can't get done, that doesn't feel good. I've had situations myself where something like this has happened, and it made me even question myself and the estimation of my own abilities. When someone's internal dialogue starts to create self-doubt, or just as bad, when someone else's actions starts to create feelings of failure within yourself, it takes a lot of self-reflection and control not to also let it create hard feelings. When the person you think is making you look bad is also a strong woman who's pushing gender normative boundaries, you get the perfect storm. Ego threat is conceptualized as the threat to a person's self-image or self-esteem. High threats to your ego tend to be the result of two factors. These two factors are high relevance, which asks the question, does this area of success matter to you? And high closeness, which asks, is the person causing the threat a regular part of your life? When the answer is yes to both, you encounter a high ego threat. In these cases, our egos will work extra hard to maintain the status quo and remove the threat. This is what I was encountering. Now, you might be thinking that this was just one business manager that was having an issue. After all, we've all had to work with people that maybe we didn't get along with. But that wasn't what was going on here. There came a time with this company when I wasn't looking after one dealership. I was looking after the deals that had been lost to finance for 10 dealerships, each of whom had 2 or 3 business managers So suddenly one business manager became a group of over 25 people that was being impacted by me just doing my job. And I was able to see this form of threat being manifested in many different ways. So if I was to sum up all of what we've talked about so far into a few key points, the challenge that we face coming into or succeeding in this industry is that we shake things up. We challenge the way that men have been programmed to interact with us. It's threatening when we're smart or when we don't let ourselves be pushed around. But we can't let that stop us. I was watching a talk Lisa Nichols gave a few years ago, where in speaking about her success, she says in part, "It's time to give the world notice. Give the world notice that you've been here. Give the world notice that you've played polite long enough. Give the world notice that unapologetic just showed up. Give the world notice that non-negotiable just showed up." So what does that look like? It means that if we want to be treated as the equals we are, we have to stop believing that we aren't. And we have to stop acting like we aren't. I've seen female salespeople not want to do the dirty work that comes with the job, like brushing the cars off after a big snowfall or going to get cars out of a compound. We have to stop playing the girl card if we don't want to be seen as needing special treatment. A little earlier on, I mentioned that when I started my career, the fear of losing my job held me back from standing up for myself. Power imbalances at work are built into the system and often allow for those who hold the power to abuse it. Even without the intention of an abuse of power, vulnerable employees can be afraid to give voice to situations that make them uncomfortable. In large part, change is going to rely on those of us who are no longer afraid of losing our jobs to be the voice for those who are. That means that we have to stop situations when they arise, and we have to ask the questions. Why are you saying that? What do you mean by that? This is how that makes me feel, or this is how that made that person feel. Call out sexism when you see it. The truth is, it's often unintentional. This example has always stuck with me. When I was much younger than I am now, I worked for my family's company. Having a daughter he wanted to be strong and successful, my father used to tell people he was a feminist. He promoted the success of women and was very proud of the fact that he promoted women into senior executive positions within his company. Try not to judge him too harshly for that. It was the 80s and it was a different time. In any case, one day, he was telling me about an interview he had where he had questioned a female candidate on how she was going to be able to be an executive in the company with 3 young children at home. I asked him if he also asked that of the male candidates. It had never even occurred to him. My point is, he wanted to promote women, but he couldn't help but be influenced by his social programming. This is still happening today. It just looks different. We can't blame anyone for living what they have learned, but what we can do is ask if what they learned is how they want to live. For meaningful change to happen, we need the guys to be part of it. Program behavior can only be changed through deliberate action. My hope is that at least for the guys watching today, this will cause you to think about the things you say and do on a daily basis and how you interact with the women around you. The challenge is for you to catch yourself when you're applying a label differently to a woman than you would to a man. Knowledge is power. And I also hope that by listening to some of the struggles that we face as women, that the men will also be part of creating safe workspaces. Be the person to speak up when you hear something that shouldn't be said. I'll share one last story that gives me hope that change can come from just being more aware. I've been sharing the development of this talk with someone close to me who happens to also be the dealer partner at a franchise dealership. So we were talking a couple of days ago and he was telling me about a situation that had happened recently in his store. He was in the sales office one afternoon when one of the sales managers came back from taking an offer, and as he came into the office, he commented on the physical appearance of a customer. It's the kind of thing that happens every day in dealerships. This day, instead of letting it slide, he stopped that sales manager and he asked him to consider what he was saying and if it was something that he would want to have been said about his daughter. That stopped him dead in his tracks. Now, I also know this sales manager, and he's genuinely a nice guy. I'm very sure it didn't even occur to him coming out of his mouth that what he was saying was wrong. The point is that in this industry, and in many others, a culture of subconscious objectification and marginalization exists, and we all need to play our part in breaking it. I want to end by speaking directly to those of you who, like I was, are still being held back by fear. There are circumstances where I know you can't stick your neck out, and it's my hope that through talks like this one and movements like Me Too, that change is coming for you. In the meantime, that doesn't mean that you have to be less of yourself. Fear is a 4-letter word. Even if you can't correct the label today, to quote the notorious RBG, better bitch than mouse. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being here with me today.